As opposed to just taking advantage of the sand that's underneath the ocean. A simple way to think about it.
How do you do? Wow, well done, John.
Okay, and then my last comment is just asking staff to be thinking of ways for us to be following technology. In light of the fact that, Mr. Bishop, I understand that this is not an area that we are typically involved in, on these intakes. Our focus is discharge, but we have this one shot, and it just makes me uncomfortable to think that we've got to get it. Of course, we can come back and amend it for future facilities, but what tool would we have to do some sort of a review or an update? Not to say that we have to do something about it, that we have to respond, but just some way of keeping up on the technological advances.
And we will think about how to look at that and think about that. But I would say to comfort you a little bit, I think that between the development of the once-through cooling policy and this ocean desalination policy, this development's going on for a long period of time. It has really pushed people to look at technologies. And so it's not like people haven't thought that we're heading in this direction and been looking at different ways. That's why people are exploring things like subsurface intakes and different screen sizes, is in part, I wouldn't say we can take all the credit, but in part because we've been talking about this for 7 or 8 years.
Oh, yeah, we've covered most of questions or comments or discussion items from my fellow board members, so I don't have a whole lot more. I'm sensitive to generic data collection requirements. There was that idea of the 3 years ought to do it kind of thing. I'm just encouraged looking at that and finding ways to make take advantage of existing data collection that may have been done, and to give some credit and use of existing data. And I know you can figure out a way to try to incorporate that. So I just want to encourage that. I want to echo my appreciation for West Basin and others that have gone out and done some data collection. I mean, an 18-month study is nothing to shake a stick at. That's a commitment. There's some information that they've gathered. I think their project objectives have been clear, that they're trying to optimize the multiple objectives of desalination from both environmental protection and water supply reliability. So I think they have some operational findings that are relevant to the difficult decision about slot size, as we've been calling it. Many of us can harken back to a lot of other processes where we're trying to optimize, organism removal kind of thing. I was involved in the ballast water treatment discussions. It's an ongoing challenge. It's the reverse, where you're trying to keep things out. Well, I guess it is. You're keeping things out. There's a different goal there as far as keeping invasive organisms from coming into the country kind of thing. But similar challenges, in terms of economics, performance of the filter, having it be practical in terms of its implementation. And so I appreciate the discussion today at the workshop and moving us toward that goal of optimizing protection and operation. And so I thought there was some relevant information there. Just wanted to acknowledge some good points brought up by the environmental community, to check our assumptions on things like intake velocity. I did appreciate the discussion about best use of recycled water. I didn't mean to imply that I had the answers on that. That it's just an ongoing debate and discussion. There's a short-term element to it and a long-term. And I think maybe tightening up our language about other uses besides commingling is a good idea. I think Paul Hunt began to discuss that, so that tightening up that language I think is important.
It might also be a place for conditional approvals if you're co-located.
Yeah, yes, it's a complex issue, it's site specific, but it may very well be a good use of water, at this time with this decision point in this location. I want to, it's interesting because the discussion was brought up about what's your basis for capacity. Are you relying on the water plan, which, our sister agency, Department of Water Resources, has done a lot of research, and but those aren't perfect estimates of what water demand are, and that sort of thing. And it was a relevant point that there can be a circular discussion as far as land use planning locally and what the water demand is. So we need to allow just a public process to review the assumptions on capacity. I'm not sure what more we would put in our language. I'm not sure. I'm looking forward to suggestions. Like folks say, it is a sensitive subject. I think it needs to be looked at and confirmed. So I'm interested in input, as far as what we would add or subtract. Again, I think the science panels have provided a basis for salinity toxicity, and generically, I think we can approach other discharges of brine to the ocean using the science panel findings. So I want to encourage staff to broaden this besides just seawater desalination brine in terms of the ocean plan. That was a point brought up by South Coast Water District. And I believe, but it needs to be looked at more. I don't know the answer, but I think we can take advantage of the science panel's findings to find a path of regulatory coverage for brine that extends beyond seawater desalination. Yep, and I think that's all I have. I just want to thank everyone for their thoughtful participation, not just today, but in the stakeholder processes that we've been trying to put out there to have some really higher level discourse on this issue. Folks bring up, yes, there's a drought. We've learned, it's just a little more proximate to our experience these days about the very real possibility of our communities running out of water. It's happening. Cambria was mentioned today. They're moving quickly to try to come up with a project there to reuse wastewater. Desalination is a safety net for our state, and so when folks say it should be a last resort, there's a lot of economic incentive to make it kind of a last resort in terms of operationally, but I believe that this is prudent for us to work diligently toward planning for it and in the infrastructure of our water in the state. So thanks for everyone for helping pull that rope in the same direction and doing it in an environmentally sustainable way.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I probably have more, but folks have mentioned a lot of the things. I just think there's an interesting convergence for clarity here in a lot of ways, where people want to target or they don't want so much flexibility. So the challenge is, of course, finding the sweet spot, where by doing a policy, we're narrowing it down so they don't have 9 totally unpredictable different ways of looking at it, while allowing for enough site-specific flexibility that just makes sense. So that, I think, in some ways is the hardest place to go. And I think on both proponent side and environmental concern side, people all said that. So that's, I sort of think that's and that it cuts across all kinds of issues. So we need to do a screen, no pun intended, for that, to be sure. The other issues people raised already, which I think are important, the dilution area was raised. We need to think about impact and mitigation and how measured. I heard a lot of different things on that. Some in terms of, are you picking indicator species? Are you talking about the whole suite of marine life, et cetera? I'm going to want to focus on what we mean in terms of impact and mitigation, and where we might be able to be a little more clear and understand a little better the multiplier idea, or where the margin of safety is in terms of mitigation. I've never really seen one for one anywhere feel adequate, because you can't guarantee it. I know we've talked about a lot of different models out there, but I think we're going to need to try and be as clear as we can on that, in addition to the follow-up to figure out how we help develop good mitigation, if there's an opportunity there for good mitigation, as opposed to having people do mitigation that's not really maybe the highest and best mitigation that we might need. On screen size, I want to talk about that a little bit more. I'd like to know what the screen sizes are that are used all over the world. I was a little surprised the Israelis use 5, but they're in the, I don't know if there's a difference between here and the Mediterranean. I don't know if we're setting totally new ground, but I really do want to understand so that we don't set it someplace that might not work while we're being appropriately protective. And so I'm going to want to focus on that, but I'm also going to want to know what are people doing where and in what context, which doesn't mean we have to follow everyone, but we can't be so far ahead that we risk not knowing what we're doing. So I think that's important. This whole perverse consequence on the wastewater, there is an advantage to wastewater as discharge, but we want to discourage recycling. They think about ways to deal with that, and maybe conditional approval in that kind of setting is a way to do it if we have the ability legally to do that. I know you don't want us putting conditional permits on everything because it defeats this purpose of that code or the code section, but in some cases where somebody's co-located with something that may not last, then that seems a reasonable potential.
I think that this is an area that we would like you all to think about, because staff proposed essentially a policy here that says, location near a discharge that can be used for recycled water would be the best for marine life. That's essentially what they're saying. But there may be, from a bigger policy view, that may not be the best thing for us to do. We may allow it, but it may not be the best. And right now it's listed as the best.
Right.
And so that's an area that we should, as a board and staff, be thinking about, because we don't have to preclude it to remove it as being the best location. We just have to take out one of the a couple of the assumptions, or a couple of the items in here to reduce that. So,
Right, so I want us to think about that. The brackish desal, you followed up on that issue. On the technological innovation and the issue, it's an important point. I think given that we have a limitation on dealing with existing or new ones, and we want this policy to last, I think we're going to need some kind of yearly technology review, frankly, of some sort. I want to think about how we deal with that. I don't want to do a whole big expert panel, but I am a little concerned about setting something in stone that may be there for 10 years.
so I really
how do we
would
deal with that?
think that we need to think about what we want out of that. We've been looking at technologies for intakes for 10 years, and they haven't changed. There's still screens, and there have been a couple of inventions that so far haven't gone beyond concept phase.
So you're not seeing this as a rapidly moving arena on the intake side of the world?
That's right. I'm a little concerned about setting us up for an annual update on what's going on. I think that we can think about directing staff to come back every few years to talk about it and see if anything's changed. But I'd be very concerned about, I don't see it as moving that rapidly.
Well, I'd love you to think about options for dealing with
Sure.
that. How do we keep it fresh?
Well, and if I could just jump in, it doesn't have to be just a technology review. It could be an update on the implementation, and we could hear
that could work.
how different facilities have chosen to, and regional boards have chosen to address these issues.
We could do that. We could do it in the context of also looking at how we're doing on recycling, how we're doing on everything else, since we're in this all of the above mode. Just think about options there. You have to deal with Santa Barbara, but Santa Barbara does have to do some work, so I wouldn't want to make them existing and have them put on old screens, for example. I don't know what you had before in Santa Barbara. I know you sold your screens, but I don't know, maybe they were in the ballpark, or you're happy to put on whatever screens we have in the policy?
We can provide that information. We didn't sell the screens. We have the screens, but we're going to put in new screens
Oh, okay.
consistent with more modern
Okay,
technology.
good. Okay. Terrific. All right. I probably have more questions, but those are the main ones in addition to the ones that other people have mentioned. So there's a lot to folks. I think the issue of clarity will be helpful if in people's comments they actually give us language. That always helps. That tries to meet the need of more clarity, clearer targets, definitions clearer, et cetera. That would be great. Okay. That's terrific.
It's a fine piece of staff work, the basin plan
Thanks for
amendment.
all the work.
Uh,
And thank you for all working with them. And with that,
You'd like the executive director?
I would
report
like to
to-
I wanted part two of Board Member Diadamo's board report. Okay, we'll see y'all in a couple weeks. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.